Good morning to all of you, and good afternoon to all of you who are following us from Asia, from Myanmar. We're very pleased to have with us today Mr. Tom Andrews, who's the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Myanmar. Mr. Andrews started his mandate on May 1st, 2020, and this is his first press briefing here in person in Geneva. So we'll be very happy to take your questions, but first just to remind you that Mr. Andrews provided an oral update yesterday afternoon to the Human Rights Council during an interactive dialogue, and this interactive dialogue will continue this morning at 10 a.m. You can watch both his oral update and the continuation of this dialogue on UN Web TV. And without further ado, Mr. Andrews, I give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, and thank you for showing up for this news conference. I want to tell you it is so very important for the world to be paying attention to what is happening in Myanmar. The junta of Myanmar, I like to say, are like mushrooms. They thrive in the dark. And that is why when they're attacking regions of Myanmar, very often they will cut off internet access and communication access. It is the very reason why your colleagues who are covering developments in Myanmar for the news media, many of them are in prison as I speak. So it is very, very important for the world to know what is going on, and I'm so grateful for you, the media, for being here today. If you want to get an idea of the horror that is transpiring in Myanmar every day, look at the account of the attack on that school in Sagaing region just a few days ago, and you'll get a sense. There's a school in a monastery and 2 helicopter gunships, foreign-made, foreign-provided, swooping in on this school while soldiers entered the grounds with automatic weapons firing away. Children, terrified, running, looking for cover. 11 of them at least killed, literally blown up. And the story of a young boy whose arm had been blown off, screaming to his mother to please kill him because the pain was so great. That boy died. He bled to death on the school grounds. And the soldiers picked up the bodies, picked up the body parts of these children and took them away and refused to allow the parents to have the remains. This is what is happening in Myanmar every day. It is incredibly important for the world to know. It is incredibly important for the world to give a damn. It is very important for the nations of the world to stop failing the people of Myanmar and act. Take measures that are practical, that are achievable, and that could make a world of difference, that could literally save the lives of untold millions of people. Every time I report to the Human Rights Council, I tell them that things have gotten worse since my last report. This report that I'm delivered yesterday and will continue to discuss today is no different. And the fact is, as long as the international community continues on its status quo of ineffectiveness and inaction when it comes to Myanmar and the people of Myanmar, my next report will be even worse, It's inevitable. So while the accounts that I've described and have discussed and have outlined are horrible, they're not surprising. And that is the most horrible thing of all, that this has become part of daily life in Myanmar and will continue to be as long as the world continues to fail the people of Myanmar. That is my job, is to provide information, analysis, and recommendations to those who are in positions of doing something about this, and that is what I'm trying to do. So with that, I am very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Andrews. Christophe Vogt, Agence France Presse.
Thank you for taking my question. Today and yesterday in front of the Human Rights Council, you had very strong words for the countries who support Myanmar, but also for those who criticize Myanmar but don't do enough, as you say, are ineffective. First of all, can we have names? And second, what can be done, how should it be done to change things in Myanmar?
Well, the names are pretty clear. First of all, the nations that spoke up in support of the people of Myanmar, who called for action, called for an end to the violence, called for an end to the executions. It's all clear who they are. The problem is that these nations are not acting. They're not backing their words up with action. And what I have described, I've listed very specific, very practical steps that can be taken. I think the most important recommendation, if the UN Security Council will not convene and pass a resolution under Chapter 7, which would establish targeted economic sanctions, establish an arms embargo, make reference to the International Criminal Court. I mean, that's what should be done, but that's not going to be done, obviously. So if it can't be done by the Security Council, then it must be done by those nations who were speaking yesterday and will speak today in support of the people of Myanmar. What's going to be required is leadership to convene a coalition of like-minded countries who will take the actions that are necessary together in a coordinated, strategic way. Right now, you have countries doing this, countries doing that, a whole hodgepodge of things that are being done, but they don't add up. They're not focused, they're not strategic, they're not coordinated, and that's what has to happen. A coalition, a network, whatever you want to call it, needs to be convened, and that's going to require some leadership. There's a leadership vacuum, and that vacuum has to be filled, and that needs to create this kind of coordinated action that I've described. I released a report early this year, what is known in the UN nomenclature as a conference room paper. I call them special reports. I'm doing a series of them to complement my reports. It was published in February. It was a detailed report of nations who were supplying the junta with weapons. And I actually categorized them, starting with those who have supplied them with weapons since the coup, knowing full well how they were going to be used. I released a report in June on the children of Myanmar and the impact this is having on children. And I will soon be releasing a report on legitimacy and how nations, either wittingly or unwittingly, are falling into this trap of the junta to try and allow them to create this mirage of legitimacy. And so it's very important that nations not fall into that trap. And I'll talk about that a little bit this morning. In fact, I'll make one of the specific recommendations is that the junta is preparing for what it describes as an election. This is not going to be an election. It is a fraud. And it is very important that nations do not fall into the trap of appearing to support that fraud, either with technical assistance or advice of any kind. It is a fraud. Listen, I have spent a good part of my career either participating in elections or traveling around the world providing technical advice and support or election observation. And I can tell you, this is not an election. And to call it an election is to participate in a great wrongdoing to the people of Myanmar. Because again, it is part of the fraud that is trying to be perpetuated, the idea of trying to create the sense of legitimacy and inevitability that the propaganda machine of the junta is using in Myanmar. It's critically important. Whether you step up and take the action that's needed or not, at least don't take action that sets us back. Don't be part of this atrocity that's going on in Myanmar. Yes, sir. Sorry.
Thank you, sir. Nabil Abisab, Al Arabi TV station. I see that you have a message to the member states in general, but what about China, P5 member and veto power in the Security Council, and obviously has good influence on Myanmar's authorities? What's your message to the Chinese government on this regard? Thank you.
Well, I mentioned in my report China specifically as one of the sources of the weapons that are being used against the people of Myanmar. But let me say this. The neighbors of Myanmar have the most at stake of what's going on in that country. It is not in the interest of any country to have a conflagration blowing up even more so in that country. I can see a major flow of refugees out of that country if the trajectory that we're on right now continues. This is extremely important, but most important for the neighbors of Myanmar, including China, including ASEAN countries. So it is in their interest to take action. I am doing everything I can to encourage, excuse me, all countries, particularly those on the Security Council, to take action. I will be in New York next month, making a personal appeal to those countries, and you know, it's obviously many people will point to the obstacles that sit on the Security Council to the passage of a Security Council resolution. We know this. But what's also frustrating, what is to some people even more frustrating, are for those countries that talk about their concern for the people of Myanmar and call for action to stop the atrocities being committed against the people of Myanmar. But they're not taking the action necessary to actually make those words mean something. So I talk to a lot of people in Myanmar on a regular basis, and I can tell you that as frustrating as it is to deal with countries on the Security Council that are waving that veto, it is just as frustrating to hear these speeches and not see action. So I think if we're going to point fingers, I think we have to point fingers at all of us. We all have responsibility here, and we're all failing the people of Myanmar.
Thank you. Is there any questions from the room? All those journalists participating remotely, if you would like to ask questions, if I can ask you to kindly raise your hand. Yes, Isabel Sacco from EFE.
Yes, good morning. I am Isabel Sacco. I work for EFE, Spanish News Agency. My question is I recall from the report by the International Independent Mission on Myanmar that they mentioned they went through how the sanctions failed to make harm to the regime, and how some countries continue to do business, maybe in minor amounts, but anyway, with Myanmar, with enterprises that are controlled by the army. So my question is, what is your comment on this? How countries could reinforce the implementation of the sanctions, how this failure is helping to the regime to get resources from abroad. And well, that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very, very good and important question. There are many countries that have stepped forward to provide sanctions, impose sanctions on Myanmar, and there are businesses who are recognizing that it is impossible for them to continue to do business and to function in Myanmar under these conditions. I will be issuing, in addition to the conference room reports that I've mentioned, we're now working on, my team and I are working on a report that is going to be delving into, with respect to weapons. Our first report was on the role of nations in supplying these weapons. Our follow-up report, which will be coming out, I hope, before the end of the year, is going to focus on the private sector and those brokers and those businesses and those investors who are making these weapons transfers possible, who they are, and what can be done about them. They need to be identified clearly, and I'm going to be doing everything I can to do so, and action needs to be taken. But short of action, as I mentioned, by the Security Council, it's going to be up to nations, individual nations, to impose the kind of tough, targeted sanctions that are going to be required to stop this madness. The key here is to stop the flow of weapons, but also to stop the flow of revenue that is flowing into the coffers of the junta. And you know, I'm about to make this point in the chamber, but just to put this in perspective, when Ukraine was invaded, it took the United Nations just a matter of days, and the nation states of the United Nations, just a matter of a handful of days to take extraordinary action. In contrast, for Myanmar and the people of Myanmar, and they see this, right? They support the people of Ukraine. They're sympathetic with the people of Ukraine, but they look at the difference between how the world reacted to that attack and how the world is reacting to the attack upon them, the people of Myanmar. And they ask me, why? Why is this difference? I mean, so just to break it down, in the case of Myanmar, unlike the case of Ukraine, there has not been a Security Council resolution. There has not been an emergency special session of the General Assembly. There has not been the targeting of Myanmar's access to international banking. There have been no sanctions against Myanmar financial institutions like the Myanmar Foreign Trade Bank. There has been no freezing of Myanmar central bank assets, except for what the action the United States took early on in this crisis. And there has been no mobilization of a multi-nation task force to identify, hunt down, and freeze the assets of the military junta and its cronies, such as the task force that has been announced with respect to Russia. So when I talk about coordination, that's the kind of coordination I'm talking about. There are entities in all of these countries that have the capacity to do the research so that these revenue flows can be stopped. And this is not just a theory, this is actually happening. We can see it happening with respect to the invasion of Ukraine and Russia. So the question is, why can't this happen with respect to the atrocities that are being placed upon the people of Myanmar? Why not Myanmar is the question. It's possible to do. We've seen it. It's happening before our eyes. Why not Myanmar? So I appreciate the question.
Yes, Nick Cumming-Bruce from the New York Times.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, in that context, how do you assess the leverage that ASEAN has in this situation, and how do you assess the extent to which that leverage is being used? Thank you.
That's a very good question. ASEAN, obviously, not only has a great deal at stake, but the world has put a lot of focus and attention on ASEAN, and ASEAN taking the lead to this. I think a very important statement. I met with the Foreign Minister of Malaysia a few months ago, Saifuddin Abdullah, and he said that the ASEAN 5-point consensus, he stated the obvious, is not going anywhere, and that there needs to be a fundamental rethink of ASEAN's approach to the crisis in Myanmar. And I think that he's exactly right. And I'm hoping that ASEAN, particularly as it prepares for its next convening of ministers in November, as Indonesia prepares to assume leadership of ASEAN and the chairmanship of ASEAN, that they will go through this rethinking process. And frankly, I hope the whole world goes through a rethinking process of the role that is being played by member states and groups of member states. But as I mentioned, ASEAN has a great deal of stake here, and there is going to be a significant impact on ASEAN member states and the neighbors of Myanmar if this thing isn't stopped, if this horror is not stopped. So my hope is that ASEAN will be going through this process of its rethink, and that there'll be action, not simply a 5-point consensus, but an action plan, a strategy to drive that action plan, and that it will be linked to action that will be taken by the rest of the international community.
Thank you. I think we have another question from Isabelle Sacco, FA.
Thank you very much. It's about the transfer of weapons. You mentioned, it is well known that Russia is one of the main providers of, it's mentioned also by the mission, one of the main providers of weapons to the army in Myanmar. And you mentioned a few minutes ago that one of the sources of weapons is China. But could you give, please, us a summary of after the coup d'etat, what are the main, apart of Russia and China, what are the main suppliers of illegal or illegal transfer of weapons? Thank you.
Thank you. There were 3 countries that have provided weapons to the junta since the coup: Russia, China, and Serbia. And I outlined that in my report. And I want to say that in the case of Serbia, they have announced that they will not be authorizing any future transfers of weapons from Serbia. So they're to be commended for that.
Yes, Christophe Vogt, AFP.
Thank you. I was just wondering if you can give us the answer to the question you asked, which is why is there this difference in treatment between what you've seen after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia and what's happening for years now in Myanmar? What's your clear answer to that why, or is there one?
I don't have one. I don't have a clear answer. I don't. And I'm asked that by people in Myanmar, and I just don't know. Out of sight, out of mind. This crisis is, and that's why it's so important for you to be here. People have no understanding of what's going, of the hell, living hell, that life in Myanmar is right now. And if they did, I think that there would be a difference. There would be a change. It's why the visibility of this crisis is so very, very important, and why your role is so very, very important. And unfortunately, your colleagues, many of your colleagues who are in Myanmar, who have provided extraordinarily important information, cannot because they are in prison. And as I mentioned yesterday, in addition to the 4 executions of the 4 democracy advocates, including a former parliamentarian, there are 82 political prisoners on death row right now. And with respect to and this is another example of the frustration that has been expressed by ASEAN and ASEAN leaders. The leader of Cambodia, Hun Sen, made a personal appeal to Min Aung Hlaing to not execute the 4 prisoners, political prisoners, that they announced that they were going to execute. He made a personal appeal, personally and as the chair of ASEAN, on behalf of all of ASEAN. And we all know what happened.
Emma Farge from Reuters.
Good morning. I was hoping you could elaborate a little bit more on your comments about the upcoming election. What signs are you seeing, concrete examples that show to you that it's not going to be a free and fair election? And what are your concerns if the junta is confirmed in power for another, I don't know how many years? Thank you.
Well, they're not going to be legitimately confirmed, number one. They are going to try to hold power with the power of weapons. I mean, they're holding a nation of 54 million people hostage. I think the best way to think of them is not as any kind of a governmental entity, but as a criminal gang that has literally taken over the country and are holding its leaders and its people hostage. That's what's happening. Now, you cannot have a free and fair election when you have arrested, incarcerated, and executed those in opposition. It is impossible to have a free and fair election under those conditions. So they may want to have advice on the balloting process or some other technicality about running an election, but none of that matters if the fundamentals of a free and fair election, the opportunity for people to have a choice, a voice in their future. It's impossible if you've locked up and are killing the opposition. It's just impossible. So it is critically important. I'm warning countries. And as I say, I've traveled to many countries. I've provided election assistance, technical assistance. I've been on election observation missions. I've viewed campaigns. I've worked with political parties. And my fear is that wittingly or unwittingly, there's going to be people who might go in and try to provide that kind of quote-unquote technical assistance in a system in which a free and fair election has been made impossible, and thereby add credibility or the veil of legitimacy to a very, very illegitimate process. So I'm going to be releasing the fourth in my conference room papers that's coming out. That will be coming out fairly soon. I'll be going into details of this and the ways in which, the meetings, the conferences, the various ways that the junta tries to project legitimacy. But I think one of the biggest dangers we're facing right now is this fake election.
Thank you. This will be a very short press conference because Mr. Andrews will have to return in room 20 to resume the interactive dialogue with the Human Rights Council. Do you have any closing remarks, sir?
Only, and I apologize, I don't walk as fast as I used to, so it's going to take me a little bit to get over there. But if you have any additional questions or you want to talk with me at all, I'm readily available. I'm available today. I'm here tomorrow morning, and I'm available by calling or Zoom or whatever it is. I'm at your disposal. So please don't hesitate to reach out to me, contact me, and speak with me. I just can't tell you how much I appreciate the fact that you're here and that you're helping to tell the story to the world. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Andrews. And just to remind you that after the interactive dialogue with the Special Rapporteur, the Human Rights Council will consider a report from OSCHR on the remaining challenges to implementing the recommendation of the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on Myanmar. So you can also watch this meeting via UN Web TV. Thank you, Mr. Andrews, and have a very good day. Thank you.
Thank you all.